US President Donald Trump delivered a critical address to the United Nations General Assembly this week, charging the institution with failing to act to solve spiraling conflicts and immigration woes. This has led to criticism of the role of the UN in the world today, and if there is still a need for such organizations in the world today. For more on this, we are joined by Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. That's Professor Adekeye Adebajo. Professor Adebajo, a very good evening to you. And as we saw this week at the United Nations General Assembly, from faulty teleprompters to faulty escalators, to some delegates even walking out during the address and prior to the address of the Israeli Benjamin Netanyahu. Lots to unpack there. What were some of your take-homes?
Thank you very much, and good evening to you and your viewers. I think, as people say, if the United Nations did not exist, it would need to be invented. This is an absolutely essential multilateral organization and the most important. So things that we take for granted, for example, coordinating global health, taking care of refugees, helping to coordinate telecommunications around the world. These are all things that are done by the UN, and also providing humanitarian relief. These complaints about the UN have been around for all the 8 decades that it's also been there. So that's not a surprise. The main question should be how to fix and reform the United Nations for a world that is rapidly evolving. And it's also important to note that it's the member states that determine whether the UN is successful or not. And when you have the largest contributor like the United Nations basically taking an axe to the global multilateral system, as Donald Trump is doing, then you're not going to have an effective United Nations. So the problem in some ways is with the member states as much as the organization.
And, thanks for also reminding us of the other functions that the United Nations plays outside of what we see, because what we see appears to be, a toothless or a dog with a bark without a bite, because we know about what's going on in the Middle East as well. The US President Donald Trump went onto that podium and spoke about climate change being the biggest con job as well, a biggest scam and a hoax, and this being permitted. Is this usual?
Well, I mean, any country can basically say whatever it likes at the United Nations. And the US is the host country. It provides 22% of its budget and 25% of the peacekeeping budget. So it's not a country that can be ignored. The UN's role in the US role in the founding of the UN was also essential. It was based in New York because it was felt that the US, being missing from the League of Nations, its predecessor, was one of the contributors to the Second World War. And its charter was also largely written by US diplomats at the State Department, with very strong support from its president, Franklin Roosevelt. So what Trump is doing is actually an act of infanticidal institutionalism, if you like. He's destroying the very institution that the United States gave birth to. A lot of the claims that Donald Trump made were also false. For example, 90% of scientists agree on the dangers of climate change and global warming. He talked about China not really being a country that's relying on wind energy, and it's actually got the largest wind energy in the world. He talked about solving 7 conflicts which have not been solved, even the one between the DRC and Rwanda, which we know the most about in Africa. We know the Eastern Congo is still a very unstable region. So I think it's important to unpack and demystify some of the lies that the US president was trying to spread at the United Nations.
But what also is the world to say when the UN gives a podium to such lies to be spread globally?
As I said, any country, there are over 140 leaders that have gone to the United Nations. This happens every year. There's a high-level segment of the United Nations General Assembly in September of every year, around the second or third week. And all the 140 leaders are given time and space to say whatever they want. And so that is part of the democratic ethos, if you like, of free speech and free debate. You can't stop leaders from saying what you want. You have to hope they'll be responsible enough in terms of how they actually portray realities.
Would you say it's a bit of a stretch, but it is plausible to say that the UN is only as strong as its stronger member states, such as countries such as the US?
We have to understand what the basic bargain was at the creation of the United Nations. You know, when it was created in 1945, it was basically set up to succeed or fail based on cooperation between its 5 permanent members. So the US, China, Russia, France, and Britain were given vetoes based on the fact that their cooperation or non-cooperation would determine the failure or success of the United Nations. In exchange, the smaller powers were given more influence over socio-economic development issues and also the power of the purse because they could pass the budget. But I think it's important to note that the UN has had successes. If you think of peacemaking and security, peace was brought to Mozambique, Sierra Leone, El Salvador, Cambodia by United Nations peacekeeping. Even last year, despite all the budget cuts that we've had recently, the UN was able to provide humanitarian relief to 116 million people across the world. So it's important also to balance our analysis with what the UN actually does. But it has also had failures in places like Rwanda and Angola and Bosnia. And so we have to fix that as well. But the best way to do it is through cooperation, not condemnation.
And just finally, Prof, when we're looking at the UN's decision, I mean, it was the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupation of Palestine that found that there is actually a genocide taking place in Palestine committed by Israel, yet we also had Israeli leaders there at the United Nations welcomed. So what does it mean when you have an arm of the UN who then says there is a genocide going on there, and then what?
Yes, and by the way, a very prominent South African national, Navi Pillay, who used to be head of human rights at the UN, was chairing that commission that came out with that finding. But it's a commission of inquiry that has no binding powers on the members. And you have to remember what I said about the veto. So the United States has one of the 5 vetoes and has used that veto to protect Israel. So the UN itself doesn't have the kind of enforcement capacity to be able to override that. And in any case, you have to go through institutions also like the International Criminal Court and the United Nations International Court of Justice, to which South Africa took Israel on charges of genocide. And those processes also have to play themselves out. But because the US, the most powerful member of the United Nations, is protecting Israel, it can get away with some of these crimes, unfortunately.
Prof, really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you for sharing your insights with us.